After my son died, my daughter-in-law brought her two children to my seaside house, just for the summer. They never left. 4 years later, she dragged me to court, but when I presented an old diary, the judge raised his hand and said, "Enough. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." The salt-stained envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind that still tasted of grief 4 years later. I held it between my fingers like something diseased, watching the Pacific waves crash against the rocks below my cottage windows. The return address made my chest tighten. Hendricks, Carnegie and Associates, Family Law. Inside, legal papers that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. Petition for adverse possession. Claim of continuous occupancy. Request for title transfer. The words swam together until one phrase crystallized with brutal clarity. Plaintiff seeks legal ownership of the property at 1247 Ocean View Drive, currently occupied by defendant. My property. My home. The cottage Gregory and I bought 37 years ago when he was still alive, when our son Jimmy was just 8 years old, running barefoot across these weathered deck boards. I set the papers on the kitchen table where Jimmy used to do his homework, where he brought Willa for Sunday dinners after they married, where he held his newborn twins, Wendy and Jonathan, his face glowing with the same wonder I'd felt holding him. The same table where 4 summers ago, Willa had sat crying as she explained why she needed to bring the children here just for the summer while she figured things out after Jimmy's funeral. "Mom, Susan," she'd said, using that careful tone she'd perfected over the years. "The kids need stability. They need the ocean air, the space to grieve. You understand, don't you? Just until I can get back on my feet." I'd understood. I'd understood that grief makes people desperate, makes them reach for whatever feels safe. I'd understood that my grandchildren, then 6 and 8, needed their grandmother's arms and their father's childhood bedroom, and the sound of waves that had lulled Jimmy to sleep for 18 years. What I hadn't understood was that, just for the summer, would stretch into 4 years. That Willa would use my address on school enrollment forms, claim my cottage as her primary residence on tax documents, receive her mail here while never once asking if this arrangement still worked for me. What I hadn't understood was that kindness, offered freely in grief, could be weaponized in court. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Willa's voice, smooth as ever. "Susan, I assume you got the papers. Look, I know this seems harsh, but my lawyer says it's just a formality. You'll always have a place here. It's just that legally speaking, this has been our primary residence for years now, and with the kids settled in school." I listened to her voice drone on about property values and legal precedent and what's best for Wendy and Jonathan. Through the kitchen window, I could see those same children, now 10 and 12, building sandcastles on what she was claiming as her beach. Wendy's laugh carried on the wind, the same musical sound that had once belonged to Jimmy at that age. "The lawyer says since you've been living in the guest room mostly anyway, and we've been maintaining the property and paying utilities." Willa's voice faded as I noticed something else through the window. A man in a suit standing on the beach, taking photographs of the cottage, measuring distances with some kind of device. "Willa," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the earthquake building in my chest. "Who is that man on my beach?" A pause. "Oh, that's just the property appraiser. For the legal stuff. Susan, you're getting upset over nothing. This is all just paperwork to protect the kids' interests. You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." I knew no such thing. What I knew was that Jimmy's widow had been playing a very long game, and I'd been too buried in my own grief to see the board being set around me. After I hung up, I walked through my cottage, seeing it with new eyes. Willa's furniture had gradually replaced mine in the living room. Her children's artwork covered the refrigerator. Her name had gradually appeared on the utility bills and even the insurance policies, while the property tax statements still arrived in my name. She'd been erasing me from my own home so slowly, so systematically, that I'd barely noticed until the legal papers made it official. In the back of my bedroom closet, behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and regret, I found the cardboard box I'd hidden there 4 years ago. Inside, beneath Jimmy's baby pictures and his school reports, lay a leather-bound journal I'd forgotten I'd kept. My handwriting, careful and precise, documenting conversations, dates, financial contributions. A habit born from years of being married to an accountant, continued out of the instinct that someday, someone might question my version of events. I opened to a random page, July 15th, 2020. Willa asked for $800 to cover Wendy's summer camp. Said Jimmy's life insurance still tied up in probate. I wrote check Naruto 847. She promised to pay back when insurance settled. Note: this is the fourth temporary loan since Jimmy's funeral. Page after page of careful entries. Every financial contribution, every conversation about living arrangements, every promise Willa had made and broken. Every time she'd assured me this was temporary while simultaneously making it more permanent. The property appraiser was gone now, but I could see his footprints in the sand, marking boundaries around what Willa wanted to claim as hers. I thought about the 37 years Gregory and I had walked that same beach, the storms we'd weathered in this cottage, the mortgage payments we'd made faithfully every month until the place was truly ours. I thought about Jimmy's childhood summers, his first girlfriend brought here for family barbecues, his wedding reception in the backyard under string lights we'd hung ourselves. I thought about how grief had made me generous, and how that generosity was being used to steal everything I had left of the life I'd built. The phone rang again. This time Willa's tone was less conciliatory. "Susan, I spoke with my lawyer. He says you need to understand that continued resistance will only make this harder for everyone. The kids are settled here. This is their home now. Fighting this will just create trauma for Wendy and Jonathan. And honestly, at your age, do you really need all this space? At my age." As if 69 years of living had earned me the right to a smaller life, not a larger one. "Willa," I said, my voice so calm it surprised me. "I'll be contesting this." "Susan, please, be reasonable. Where would you even go? You don't have anywhere else." But as I stood there, holding the phone, looking out at the ocean that had been my companion for 4 decades, I realized something that shifted everything. Willa was wrong. I did have somewhere else to go. I had the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most dangerous place of all. The law office smelled like leather and ambition. Kirk Blanchett, the attorney I'd hired with money from my teacher's pension, was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that reminded me of Gregory. He'd been recommended by my neighbor, Mrs. Wagner, whose own property dispute had been resolved favorably under his guidance. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, reviewing the papers Willa had served me, "I have to be honest. Adverse possession cases are complex. Your daughter-in-law has documented 4 years of continuous occupancy. She's been paying utilities, maintaining the property." "With my money," I interrupted, pulling out my journal. "Every payment, every expense. I documented everything." Kirk leaned forward as I opened the leather-bound book. His expression shifted as I read entries aloud. August 3rd, 2020. Willa said water heater broken. Emergency repair needed $1,200. I paid Palmer Plumbing directly. Willa said she'd pay me back when life insurance cleared. Check 12851, September 15th, 2020. Property tax bill arrived in my name. Willa asked me to pay it directly, said she'd reimburse. 3D $847 $50. She never did. Check 2863, October 2nd, 2020. Willa mentioned casually that she'd changed address with school district to cottage address. Said it was just easier for Wendy's enrollment. I didn't object, assumed temporary. Page after page of careful documentation. Kirk's eyes widened as the pattern became clear. "Mrs. Taylor, this is extraordinary record-keeping. Why did you document everything so meticulously?" I smiled, thinking of Gregory bent over his desk every evening, reconciling accounts. My husband was an accountant. 34 years of marriage teaches you habits. He used to say, "Susan, if it matters enough to do, it matters enough to document. Do you have bank statements to corroborate these entries?" Every single one. Organized by date. I pulled out a manila folder thick with evidence. Gregory might be gone, but his filing system isn't. Kirk spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents, his excitement growing palpable. "Mrs. Taylor, your daughter-in-law may have been occupying the property, but you've been paying for it. That significantly complicates her claim. More importantly, several of these entries suggest she explicitly acknowledged this was temporary. I turned to a page from late 2020, November 12th. Willa said she'd found an apartment in town, planning to move after New Year. Asked if kids could finish school year at cottage. I agreed, thinking June move out. She never moved, I told him. Every few months there was a new excuse. The apartment fell through. The kids were struggling with transitions. She needed more time to save money. Always with the promise that it was temporary. Always with gratitude for my patience. Kirk made notes furiously. This establishes a pattern of temporary permission, not abandonment of the property. But Mrs. Taylor, I have to ask, why didn't you take action sooner? The question I'd been asking myself for weeks. I closed the journal, feeling the weight of my own complicity. Grief makes you stupid, I said finally. After Jimmy died, I was drowning. Willa and the children were all I had left of him. I thought I was helping family. I thought putting their needs first made me a good mother, a good grandmother. And now? Now I thought about how Willa had never once asked about my needs, my comfort, my plans for my own home. How she'd carved out space for herself and her children while relegating me to the guest room of my own cottage. How she spoke about me to the children. I'd overheard Wendy telling a friend that Grandma Susan lives with us now because she's too old to live alone. Now I think good intentions are only good if they're mutual, I said. Kirk outlined our strategy. We'd file a response challenging the adverse possession claim, presenting evidence that Willa's occupancy was permissive, not hostile. We'd document my continuous ownership and financial responsibility. We'd request a hearing. Mrs. Taylor, I should warn you. This might get ugly. Family legal battles often do. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Willa's voice on the phone, sweet and patronizing. At your age, do you really need all this space? I thought about being erased from my own life so gradually I'd barely noticed. Mr. Blanchett, I've been married, widowed, and raised a son who died too young. I've weathered 40 years of Oregon coast winters in that cottage. I think I can handle one entitled daughter-in-law. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the dread-tinged waiting that had colored most days since Jimmy's death, but actual curiosity about what came next. For the first time in 4 years, I was taking action instead of simply enduring. The cottage looked different when I pulled into the driveway. Willa's SUV was parked in the spot where Gregory and I used to park, where Jimmy had learned to drive by, carefully backing out onto the gravel road. Her children's bikes were scattered across the front porch. My front porch. Like dropped toys. Inside, Willa was making dinner in my kitchen, wearing an apron that had been my mother's. Wendy and Jonathan were at the table, homework spread across the surface where I'd once planned lesson plans for 30 years of high school English classes. Susan? Willa's voice carried forced cheer. Perfect timing. I made your favorite, tuna casserole. It wasn't my favorite. It had never been my favorite. But Willa had decided it was, based on some conversation years ago, where I'd mentioned enjoying it occasionally, and now she wielded this misremembered preference like evidence of how well she knew me. Did you meet with a lawyer today? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. I did. And? Wendy looked up from her math homework. Jonathan continued reading, but I could see his attention shift toward our conversation. These children, caught between their mother's ambitions and their grandmother's rights, innocent casualties of adult greed. And we'll see what happens, I said. Willa's smile tightened. Susan, you're being stubborn about this. The lawyer says possession is 9/10 of the law. We've lived here for 4 years. The kids think of this as home. Fighting this will just cost you money you can't afford and put Wendy and Jonathan through trauma they don't deserve. The casual mention of my finances stung because it was accurate. A teacher's pension doesn't stretch far, especially when you've been subsidizing someone else's life for 4 years. But Willa's mention of the children's trauma revealed her strategy, weaponize their emotional needs against my legal rights. Willa, can we talk privately? She followed me onto the deck, where the evening fog was rolling in from the Pacific. Below us, waves crashed against the rocks with the same rhythm that had comforted me through decades of worry, grief, and joy. "This has to stop," I said quietly. "What you're doing to me, it has to stop." Willa's mask slipped slightly. "What I'm doing? Susan, I've been taking care of this place, taking care of you. Do you think it's been easy, managing everything while you wander around in your grief? Taking care of me? Willa, I've been paying for everything. The utilities, the repairs, the property taxes. I've been funding your life while you systematically took over mine. That's not how I see it. That's not how the bank statements see it either." Something flickered in Willa's eyes. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "Susan, you offered to help. You insisted on helping. I never asked for your charity." Charity. As if my contribution to my own home was charity. "You asked for temporary shelter," I said. "I gave you 4 years. You asked for help with expenses. I paid everything. You asked for patience while you got back on your feet. When exactly were you planning to stand up? The kids deserve stability, yes. But they don't deserve lies. And they don't deserve a grandmother who's been relegated to guest status in her own home." Willa's composure cracked. "Fine. You want to fight this? You want to drag Wendy and Jonathan through a custody battle over a house? Because that's what this is, Susan. Make no mistake, you're choosing property over your grandchildren." The accusation hit like ice water. Willa had just revealed her nuclear option, the threat that had kept me compliant for 4 years. Choose the cottage or choose the children. Submit to being erased or lose access to the last living pieces of Jimmy. Is that a threat, Willa? It's reality. Courts don't look kindly on elderly people who prioritize real estate over children's welfare. And frankly, Susan, you're not getting any younger. What happens when you can't manage the stairs anymore? When you need care? At least with us here, you have family support. Family support. From someone who was actively trying to steal my home. I looked at this woman my son had loved, this mother of my grandchildren, this person who had spent 4 years masquerading care while systematically dispossessing me. I thought about Jimmy's funeral, how she'd clung to me, promising we'd take care of each other, promising the children would always know their father's family. "Willa," I said, my voice steady as the lighthouse beam that swept across the water each night. "You have no idea who you're threatening." She laughed, but it sounded hollow against the crash of waves. "Susan, please. You're a retired English teacher from a small town. I have lawyers, documentation, and 2 children who call this place home. What exactly do you think you can do?" I smiled, thinking of the journal, the bank statements, the careful documentation of 4 years of lies, thinking of Kirk Blanchett's excitement when he'd seen my evidence, thinking of something else, too, something I hadn't told my lawyer yet, something Willa had no idea I knew about. "I guess we'll find out," I said. The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. I sat beside Kirk Blanchett, my journal and manila folders arranged precisely on the table before us, while across the aisle, Willa whispered urgently with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit whose name was Maya Carnegie. Judge Brad entered, and we all rose. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of human greed dressed up as legal necessity. His eyes swept the courtroom with practiced authority before settling on the papers before him. "This is a petition for adverse possession," he began, "filed by Willa Taylor against Susan Taylor regarding property at 1247 Ocean View Drive. Ms. Carnegie, present your case." Willa's lawyer stood, her voice crisp and confident. "Your Honor, my client has maintained continuous, open, and notorious occupation of the subject property for 4 years following the death of her husband, Jimmy Taylor. During this time, she has acted as the property owner, maintaining the premises, using it as her primary residence, enrolling her children in local schools using this address, and presenting herself to the community as the homeowner." I watched Willa as her lawyer painted this picture of righteous occupation. She looked appropriately sorrowful, dressed in a conservative mustard dress, her hands folded in her lap, the grieving widow, forced by circumstances to claim what had become her family's refuge. "Furthermore," Ms. Carnegie continued, "the defendant Susan Taylor has acquiesced to this arrangement for the entirety of this period. She relocated to a guest bedroom, allowed utilities to be transferred to my client's name, and made no objection to my client's children being enrolled in school with this address. This pattern demonstrates clear abandonment of ownership rights. Judge Brad made notes. And the defendant's response, Mr. Blanchett? Kirk stood, and I felt a flutter of nervousness. Everything depended on this moment. Your Honor, we strenuously contest every claim made by the plaintiff. Far from abandoning the property, Mrs. Susan Taylor has continuously maintained financial responsibility for it. She has not relocated to a guest bedroom by choice, but has been gradually displaced in her own home by someone she welcomed in good faith during a time of mutual grief. Kirk opened my journal with theatrical precision. Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, Mrs. Taylor's contemporaneous record of events, maintained throughout the period in question. This journal documents not abandonment, but systematic exploitation. He began reading entries, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. September 2020. Willa asked me to handle property tax payment directly, promised reimbursement that never came. January 2021. Willa mentioned finding apartment, asked if children could finish school year here. I agreed, thinking June departure. March 2021. Willa said apartment plans fell through, needed few more months. I agreed. August 2021. Willa now saying children shouldn't be uprooted mid-elementary years. Asked to stay through Jonathan's 6th grade. I felt cornered but agreed. Your Honor, Kirk continued, these entries establish a clear pattern. This was never hostile occupation. This was permissive use that gradually became exploitation through a series of broken promises and manipulated circumstances. Ms. Carnegie objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. These are self-serving entries made by the defendant. Sustained as to the content of conversations, Judge Brad said, but the dates and circumstances are admissible as business records. Kirk nodded and continued. We also present bank statements showing Mrs. Taylor paid property taxes totaling over $15,000, utility bills exceeding $8,000, and maintenance expenses of more than $12,000 during the period of alleged abandonment. These are not the actions of someone who has relinquished property rights. I watched Willa shift uncomfortably as the numbers mounted. She whispered something to Ms. Carnegie, who shook her head sharply. Additionally, Kirk said, we have documentation showing that Mrs. Taylor's financial contributions were explicitly acknowledged as loans by the plaintiff, with promises of repayment that were never honored. Ms. Carnegie rose for cross-examination when Kirk finished. She approached our table with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating elderly clients. Mrs. Taylor, she began, you claim these payments were loans, yet you never demanded repayment, never set payment terms, never charged interest. Isn't it true that you made these payments willingly as gifts to your daughter-in-law and grandchildren? I had prepared for this question with Kirk, but sitting in the witness box, facing this woman's predatory smile, I felt my decades of teaching experience kick in. I had handled hostile administrators, difficult parents, and challenging students. I could handle one overconfident lawyer. Ms. Carnegie, I said calmly, when my son died, I made a choice to help his widow and children during their time of grief. That help was always described to me as temporary assistance, not permanent support. Every financial contribution was accompanied by Willa's assurance that she would repay me when her circumstances improved. But you have no written agreements, no contracts. I have something better. I have a record of every conversation, every promise, and every broken commitment. I have 4 years of systematic deception documented in real time. Ms. Carnegie tried a different approach. Mrs. Taylor, isn't it true that you've been lonely since your husband's death? That having your daughter-in-law and grandchildren in your home provided you with companionship and purpose? The question was designed to paint me as a lonely old woman clinging to family, someone who had traded property rights for company, but it backfired spectacularly. Ms. Carnegie, I said, my voice sharpening, loneliness might explain why I welcomed them. It doesn't explain why Willa felt entitled to take advantage of that loneliness to steal my home. Judge Brad's eyebrows rose slightly. Ms. Carnegie, recognizing she'd stumbled, tried to recover. Mrs. Taylor, My client has spent 4 years caring for this property, maintaining it, improving it. With my money, I interrupted. Every improvement, every repair, every utility bill, paid for with my pension, my savings, my resources. Willa has been playing house with my life while I funded her performance. Ms. Carnegie sat down, her confidence visibly shaken. Judge Brad looked at both legal teams. I'd like to hear from the plaintiff directly. Mrs. Willa Taylor, please take the stand. Willa stood, smoothing her dress, her composure intact. She took the oath and settled into the witness chair with practiced grace. Mrs. Taylor, Ms. Carnegie began, please tell the court about your circumstances following your husband's death. Willa's voice trembled slightly. A perfect touch. Your Honor, when Jimmy died, I was devastated. I had 2 small children, financial uncertainty, and overwhelming grief. Susan offered to let us stay at the cottage for the summer while I figured out our next steps. And what happened during that summer? Susan and I both realized the children were thriving there. They loved the ocean, the space, the connection to their father's childhood home. Susan seemed to enjoy having us around. She'd been so alone since Gregory's death. It felt like we were helping each other heal. When did you begin to consider the cottage your permanent residence? It happened gradually. Susan encouraged us to get settled, to think of it as home. She insisted on paying for things, said it was her pleasure to provide for Jimmy's children. By the 2nd year, when Susan moved to the guest room and told me to redecorate the master bedroom however I wanted, it seemed clear that she was ready to share ownership of the space. I felt my jaw clench. The lies flowed so smoothly, twisted just enough to make my kindness look like consent to dispossession. Mrs. Taylor, Ms. Carnegie continued, did Susan ever ask you to leave? Never directly. If anything, she seemed afraid we might leave. She often mentioned how quiet the house would be without the children's voices. Kirk rose for cross-examination, and I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes that Willa had failed to recognize. Ms. Taylor, you testified that Susan encouraged you to think of the cottage as home. Did she also encourage you to stop paying rent elsewhere? There was no formal arrangement. Did she encourage you to stop looking for your own place? Willa hesitated. The children's stability was the priority. Ms. Taylor, yes or no? Did Susan Taylor ever tell you to stop planning to move out? Not in those words, but yes or no? No. Did Susan Taylor ever tell you that you could have the cottage permanently? Another pause. Not explicitly, but her actions. Yes or no? No. Kirk consulted his notes. Ms. Taylor, you testified that Susan moved to the guest room voluntarily. When exactly did this happen? I'm not sure of the exact date. Was it before or after you told her you needed the master bedroom for your children when Jonathan started having nightmares? Willa's composure cracked slightly. That may have been a factor. And when you told Susan to redecorate the master bedroom however she wanted, weren't your exact words, Susan, since you're using this as a guest room now, you should make it comfortable for yourself? I don't recall the exact, because what you're describing as generous sharing sounds remarkably like evicting the homeowner to the smallest bedroom in her own house. Ms. Carnegie objected, but Judge Brad overruled her. Willa was floundering now, her carefully constructed narrative unraveling under Kirk's precise questions. Ms. Taylor, you've testified about Susan's financial contributions being gifts. Do you have documentation of these gifts? Thank you notes, perhaps? Any written acknowledgement that these weren't loans? We were family. We didn't need formal documentation. But you do have formal documentation for this adverse possession claim, don't you? You found time to document your residency for legal purposes, but somehow never found time to document $35,000 in alleged gifts? The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's machine. Willa looked trapped, her lawyer's objections growing more frequent and more desperate. Kirk returned to our table, and Judge Brad called for a recess. As people filed out, I remained seated, my journal closed in front of me. Willa approached, her mask of victimhood finally slipping. Susan, she whispered urgently, this is getting out of hand. We can still work something out. Shared ownership, maybe. You don't have to destroy the children's stability over pride. I looked at this woman who had spent 4 years systematically erasing me from my own life, who was still trying to manipulate me even as her lies crumbled in court. "Willa," I said quietly, "you should have thought about the children's stability before you decided to steal their grandmother's home." Her face hardened. "You have no idea what you're risking, Susan. What you're about to lose." I opened my journal to a page I hadn't shared with Kirk yet. Hadn't shared with anyone. A page that would end this charade once and for all. "Actually, Willa," I said, my voice steady as stone, "I think you're the one who has no idea what you're about to lose." When court resumed, I could feel the shift in the room's energy. Willa sat rigid beside her lawyer, who shuffled papers with the frantic movements of someone grasping for a strategy that no longer existed. Judge Brad settled into his chair with the weary expression of a man who had seen too many families destroy themselves over property and pride. "Mr. Blanchett," he said, "do you have additional evidence to present?" Kirk glanced at me, and I nodded almost imperceptibly. We had discussed this moment extensively. The nuclear option we would only deploy if necessary. Willa's performance on the witness stand, her continued lies even under oath, had made it necessary. "Your Honor, we have one final exhibit. Mrs. Taylor's journal contains entries that we believe conclusively demonstrate the plaintiff's true intentions and state of mind throughout this period." I stood and walked to the witness box, carrying my journal like a weapon. The leather was worn smooth from 4 years of careful documentation, and I knew exactly which page would end this charade. "Mrs. Taylor," Kirk said formally, "please turn to the entry dated March 15th, 2022. I found the page, my hands steady despite the earthquake this would trigger. The entry was longer than most, written late at night after a conversation I'd never forgotten. Please read the entry aloud to the court." I cleared my throat and began. March 15th, 2022. Willa had several glasses of wine tonight after putting the children to bed. She became unusually talkative about her plans. When I mentioned maybe getting the guest room painted, she laughed and said, "Susan, you don't need to pretend anymore. We both know I'm never leaving this place. You think I'm stupid? I've been documenting everything. Utility bills in my name, school records, voter registration. I've got lawyers who specialize in adverse possession. You've been so generous, so accommodating, that you've basically handed me your house. My kids deserve this place more than you do anyway. They have their whole lives ahead of them." The courtroom went dead silent. Ms. Carnegie shot to her feet. "Objection! This is clearly hearsay and highly prejudicial." Judge Brad held up his hand. "I'll allow it as a present-sense impression recorded contemporaneously. Continue, Mrs. Taylor." I turned the page, finding the follow-up entry. March 16th, 2022. I lay awake all night thinking about Willa's words. This morning she acted as if nothing happened, made coffee, asked about my plans for the day with the same sweet smile. But I know now this has all been calculated. The gradual takeover, the broken promises about leaving, the way she's positioned herself legally. None of it was accidental. I've been played by an expert. Willa's face had gone pale. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, who looked like she was watching her case collapse in real time. "Mrs. Taylor," Kirk continued, "did you make any changes to your behavior after this conversation?" I began documenting everything more carefully. I started saving every text message, every email, every receipt, and I started researching adverse possession law myself. "What did you discover?" I discovered that Willa had been researching it long before that conversation. I found printouts in the recycling, legal websites bookmarked on the shared computer, consultation notes with attorneys dating back to 2021, a full year before she drunkenly confessed her plan to me. Ms. Carnegie was frantically objecting, but Judge Brad was reviewing the additional evidence Kirk was presenting. Bank records showing Willa had consulted with attorneys. Computer records showing searches for adverse possession Oregon and how long to claim abandoned property. A paper trail of premeditation stretching back 3 years. "Mrs. Taylor," Kirk asked, "why didn't you confront Willa about this evidence when you found it?" This was the question I'd dreaded, the one that required me to admit my own complicity in my victimization. "Because I was afraid," I said simply. "Afraid of losing my grandchildren." afraid of admitting I'd been fooled, afraid of being alone again. Willa knew exactly which fears to exploit, and she used them perfectly. I looked directly at Willa as I continued. She made sure Wendy and Jonathan called me Grandma Susan, who lives with us now. She scheduled family activities during times when I might have met with friends or pursued my own interests. She gradually made me feel like a guest in my own home, while making it clear that if I objected, I would lose access to the only family I had left. And yet you continued documenting everything? My husband used to say that hope is not a strategy. I hoped Willa would eventually do the right thing, but I documented everything in case she didn't. It turns out Gregory was right, as usual. Judge Brad leaned forward. Mrs. Taylor, I'm going to ask you directly. In your opinion, was the plaintiff's occupation of your property consensual throughout the entire period? For the first summer, yes. After that, it became extortion disguised as family need. Willa knew I would never deny my grandchildren a home, so she used them as leverage to steal mine. Ms. Carnegie rose for cross-examination, but her questions were desperate attempts to salvage an unsalvageable case. She tried to paint me as vindictive, suggested I had fabricated journal entries, questioned my memory and motives. But the documentation was too extensive, too consistent, too corroborated by external evidence. When she finished, Judge Brad called for final arguments. Ms. Carnegie's was brief and unconvincing, a rehash of residency claims that had been thoroughly demolished by evidence of premeditation and false pretenses. Kirk's closing was surgical. Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental question about the nature of family obligation and legal protection. Can grief and generosity be weaponized to steal someone's home? Can the exploitation of grandparent love be disguised as adverse possession? Mrs. Susan Taylor opened her home to her son's widow and children during a time of mutual mourning. That kindness has been systematically abused for 4 years through a calculated campaign of deception and legal manipulation. He gestured toward my evidence. The plaintiff didn't stumble into adverse possession through innocent occupation. She researched it, planned it, and executed it while lying to Mrs. Taylor about her intentions. She used the defendant's love for her grandchildren as a weapon against her property rights. This is not adverse possession. This is fraud. Judge Brad called for a recess to consider his decision. The wait felt endless. I sat in the hallway with Kirk, watching Willa pace frantically while making phone calls. At one point, she approached me. Susan, please, think about Wendy and Jonathan. If you win this case, where do we go? What happens to their stability? The question that had controlled me for 4 years. The fear that had kept me compliant while she systematically stole my life. But something had changed during the trial. Watching Willa lie under oath, listening to her lawyer paint me as a doddering old woman, seeing the premeditation evidence, I finally understood that Willa's concern for her children's stability was as manufactured as everything else. Willa, I said quietly, you should have thought about their stability before you decided to build their home on a foundation of lies and theft. You're going to make them homeless over pride? You made them homeless the day you decided to steal their grandmother's house instead of building your own life. This was never about their needs, Willa. This was always about your greed. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. I don't know who you are anymore. I'm someone who stopped letting you define me. When court reconvened, Judge Brad's expression was grave. I've considered all the evidence presented in this matter. This case hinges on whether the plaintiff's occupation of the defendant's property was hostile, as required for adverse possession, or permissive and fraudulently obtained. He looked directly at Willa. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Ms. Willa Taylor entered the property with permission during a time of shared grief. However, the evidence also demonstrates that she researched and planned to claim the property through adverse possession, while simultaneously assuring the defendant that her residence was temporary. Judge Brad held up my journal. This contemporaneous documentation, corroborated by bank records and other evidence, establishes a pattern of systematic deception. The plaintiff exploited the defendant's grief and grandparent love to maintain occupation while secretly planning legal theft of the property. Willa's lawyer started to stand, but Judge Brad continued. Furthermore, The plaintiff's own testimony contains material misrepresentations about the nature of financial contributions and living arrangements. When combined with evidence of premeditation, these misrepresentations demonstrate that this alleged adverse possession was obtained through fraudulent means. The gavel came down with finality. The petition for adverse possession is denied. The plaintiff has 30 days to vacate the premises. Additionally, I'm ordering the plaintiff to pay restitution for financial contributions documented by the defendant, plus court costs and attorney fees. The sound that escaped Willa wasn't quite a scream, but close. She turned to stare at me with naked hatred, all pretense of victimhood finally abandoned. "You've destroyed us," she whispered. "Wendy and Jonathan will never forgive you for this." I looked at this woman who had spent 4 years playing a long con against her children's grandmother, who had used those children as weapons against their own family. "Willa," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 7 decades lived fully, "you destroyed yourself. I just stopped helping you do it." As people filed out of the courtroom, I remained seated, my journal closed in front of me. Victory felt different than I had expected, not triumphant, but quietly satisfying. Like successfully completing a difficult lesson plan or finishing a complicated grading period with fairness intact. Kirk shook my hand. "Mrs. Taylor, you've won everything. Your home, your rights, your dignity." I nodded, but I was thinking about something else. About Wendy and Jonathan, about the conversation that would come when they learned their mother had tried to steal their grandmother's house. About rebuilding relationships damaged by their mother's lies, about the fact that winning in court was only the beginning of winning back my life. "Mr. Blanchett," I said, "what happens now?" "Now, Mrs. Taylor, you go home, to your home, and you figure out what comes next." For the first time in 4 years, I had no idea what came next, and that felt like freedom. The cottage felt different when I walked through the door that evening. Not because anything had physically changed, but because everything had legally, emotionally, and spiritually shifted back into place. The living room still held Willa's furniture, Wendy's artwork still covered the refrigerator, and Jonathan's soccer cleats still sat by the back door. But now these were temporary intrusions in my space, not permanent erasures of my identity. Willa was in the kitchen when I entered, her movements sharp and efficient as she packed dishes into boxes. She didn't look at me, but her fury radiated like heat from a stove. "The children don't know yet," she said without preamble. "I haven't figured out how to explain that their grandmother chose a house over their happiness." I set my purse on the counter, my counter, and considered my response carefully. 4 years of Willa's manipulations had taught me to recognize emotional traps. "Willa, the children will learn that their mother chose theft over honesty. That's not my burden to carry." She whirled to face me, her mask of victimhood completely discarded. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Wendy starts middle school in the fall. Jonathan finally made friends here. This was their home, Susan. Their father's childhood home. It was never theirs to claim. You made sure of that when you decided to steal it instead of earning it." "Earning it?" Willa's voice rose. "I've been taking care of this place for 4 years, maintaining it, improving it, with my money. Every improvement, every repair, every mortgage payment I'd already made for 37 years before you arrived. Willa, you maintained my house with my resources while convincing yourself you deserved to own it. That's not caretaking, that's occupation." Willa continued packing with violent efficiency, slamming cabinet doors and shoving items into boxes. "The children will never understand this. They'll never forgive you." This was the threat that had controlled me for 4 years. The weapon Willa had wielded whenever I'd shown signs of resistance. But sitting in that courtroom, watching her lie under oath while using Wendy and Jonathan as shields for her greed, had finally broken the spell. "Willa," I said calmly, "if you've raised children who think stealing their grandmother's house is acceptable, then they have bigger problems than where they sleep at night." The sound of the front door opening interrupted our confrontation. Wendy and Jonathan entered, backpacks slung over their shoulders, their voices carrying the easy chatter of children whose biggest concern was weekend plans. They stopped short when they saw the boxes, the tension between their mother and grandmother. Mom? Wendy asked, her voice small. What's happening? Willa's expression shifted instantly, her anger transforming into martyred sadness. Sweetheart, we need to have a family meeting. Grandma Susan has decided she wants us to move out of the cottage. I watched Willa deploy the children as human shields one final time, and something crystallized in my chest. These children deserved better than a mother who used them as weapons. They deserved better than lies disguised as protection. Wendy, Jonathan, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Come sit with me. There are some things you need to understand. Willa stepped between us. Susan, don't you dare drag them into this. Willa, you dragged them into this 4 years ago when you decided to build their lives on a foundation of lies. I looked at my grandchildren, Jimmy's children, carrying his eyes and his smile and his innate sense of fairness. They were old enough now, at 12 and 10, to understand more than Willa wanted to credit them with. When your father died, I began, your mother and I were both heartbroken. I invited you to spend the summer here because I thought we could help each other heal. That was 4 years ago. But Mom said this was our home now, Jonathan said, confusion creasing his forehead. It became your home because your mother broke promise after promise to find your own place. Every few months she had a new reason why you couldn't move out. But she never told me she'd given up looking. She never told me she'd decided to stay permanently. Instead, she researched how to take the cottage away from me legally. Wendy looked between us, processing. Take it away? But your family. That's what I thought too, Wendy. But today in court, I learned that your mother has been planning to steal this cottage for years, while letting me pay for everything and telling me it was temporary. Willa's face had gone white. Susan, stop. They're children. They're children who deserve honesty. Willa, you used them as weapons against me for 4 years. You made them believe I'd abandon them if I asked for my own space back. You taught them that manipulation was love and lies were kindness. I won't be part of damaging them further. I turned back to Wendy and Jonathan. I love you both. I have always loved you. But your mother made choices that forced me to choose between being stolen from or being honest about it. I chose honesty. Wendy was crying now, not understanding the adult complexities but sensing the destruction around her. Jonathan looked angry, the way children do when the world stops making sense. So where are we supposed to go? He demanded. That's not for your grandmother to figure out, came a new voice from the doorway. We all turned to see Gregory Wagner, Mrs. Wagner's son, holding a bouquet of flowers. He was about 40, a contractor who'd done work on several neighborhood homes. I'd spoken with him occasionally over the years, but never expected him here. Gregory? I said, surprised. Mrs. Taylor, my mother asked me to bring these by to congratulate you on your court victory. But I can see this isn't a good time. Actually, I said, making a decision that surprised me, this is exactly the right time. Children, this is Mr. Wagner. Gregory, these are my grandchildren, Wendy and Jonathan. Their mother is in the process of moving out. Gregory looked at the boxes, the tears, the tension, and seemed to understand immediately. I see. Well, congratulations are still in order, I think. Mrs. Taylor, you've been fighting for your home. That takes courage. Willa bristled. Courage? She's throwing children out of the only stable home they've known. Gregory's expression hardened slightly. Ma'am, I'm a contractor. I've seen what happens when people live in places they can't afford or don't legally control. It never ends well for the children. Mrs. Taylor is giving you a chance to build something honest for your family. That's a gift, not a punishment. Something about Gregory's calm authority seemed to reach the children in a way our adult argument hadn't. Wendy wiped her eyes and looked at me directly. Grandma Susan, are you making us leave because you don't want us here anymore? The question broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. This was the fear Willa had cultivated in them, the weapon she'd used against my natural instincts. Wendy, I have wanted you here every single day for 4 years, but I wanted your mother to be honest about it. I wanted her to include me in the decision instead of just taking over my life. I wanted her to respect that this was my home too, not just yours. Could we visit sometimes? I mean, after we move? I looked at Willa, who was watching this exchange with calculation rather than concern for her daughter's pain. "Wendy, you will always be welcome in my home, both of you. But your mother and I need to agree on what that looks like, and we need to be honest with each other going forward." Gregory cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Taylor, if I may, I know of several rental properties in town that might suit a family. The school district is the same, so the children wouldn't have to change schools. And there are assistance programs for single mothers that could help with deposits and moving costs." Willa looked at him with suspicion. "And why would you help us?" "Because I'm not helping you, ma'am. I'm helping them." He gestured to Wendy and Jonathan. "Children shouldn't suffer because adults can't figure out how to treat each other with basic respect." Over the next hour, Gregory made several phone calls, connecting Willa with resources I hadn't known existed: a church program that helped with moving expenses, a rental property managed by someone he knew who was willing to work with single mothers, a furniture donation program to help them get established. Watching him work, I realized something was shifting in my chest. For 4 years, I'd been so focused on protecting what I had that I'd forgotten what it felt like to build something new. Gregory's kindness toward my grandchildren, his practical approach to solving problems, his lack of judgment about our complicated situation, it reminded me that there were still good people in the world who acted from genuine care rather than calculated advantage. As Willa grudgingly accepted the help Gregory had arranged, Wendy approached me. "Grandma Susan, will you really let us visit?" "Wendy, I would be heartbroken if you didn't. But the visits need to be planned and honest, not manipulative or secretive. Can you understand that?" She nodded solemnly. "Mom sometimes tells stories that aren't exactly true. I've noticed." The admission broke my heart for her sophistication and mended it for her intelligence. "Wendy, you and Jonathan are going to be fine. You're smart and kind, just like your father was. You'll figure out how to build good lives for yourselves." Over the following week, Willa moved out with efficient resentment. She spoke to me only when necessary, her communications clipped and hostile. But she took the resources Gregory had provided, and I heard through Mrs. Wagner that she'd secured a nice apartment in town with a program that would help her transition to full independence. The children handled the move better than I'd expected. Jonathan was initially angry, but Wendy helped him understand that they weren't losing their grandmother, just their free housing. They visited twice during that first week, and I was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries while making it clear they were genuinely welcome. Gregory stopped by several times during the moving process, ostensibly to check on how the cottage was holding up. But I suspected he was also checking on how I was holding up. His mother had told him about my husband's death, about the years of isolation and manipulation. "Mrs. Taylor," he said one evening as we sat on the deck watching the sunset, "you've got your home back. What are you going to do with it?" It was a question I'd been avoiding. For 4 years, I'd focused on surviving Willa's occupation. Now I had to figure out how to live in the space I'd reclaimed. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to remember what it feels like to make decisions based on what I want, not what other people need from me." "That sounds like a good place to start." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves crash against the rocks. For the first time in years, the cottage felt peaceful rather than tense. My furniture was back in the living room. My books were back on the shelves. My bedroom was mine again. But more than that, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished, accommodating version I'd become during Willa's occupation, but the woman who'd chosen this life, built this home, and survived decades of joy and loss with dignity intact. Willa had tried to steal my house. Instead, she'd taught me something invaluable: the difference between being generous and being exploited, between loving family and enabling thieves, between keeping the peace and keeping my self-respect. I was 69 years old, and for the first time in years, I had no idea what came next. It felt like the beginning of everything. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.